All right, we were looking at the plagues as we finished last time. We saw that many today are swayed to naturalistic explanations, but we said really the problem with any of those explanations is really the first plague and the last plague, the Nile changing to blood, and the death of the firstborn. Really, there's no naturalistic way to explain that first and the last plague. And certainly as we therefore think through the biblical text, it is a supernatural action. And even though we would agree that it comes to us in a certain literary form, as we take a look at the Torah, that we do see that there are 3 cycles of 3 that conclude with the final plague, the killing of the firstborn throughout Egypt, that leads to the release of Israel, where Pharaoh says, "Get out." That those who take the literary framework position believe that it's a nice story, but not anchored in history. All right? So though we can appreciate the fact that certainly there is a textual framework because it does reflect historically what took place, and the Spirit has directed Moses to write it with that kind of an order. And it is very interesting, even with the literary framework, the order, that basically as calamity was coming upon the Egyptians, when I put it this way, calamity was coming in a very orderly fashion, because God was the one whose hand was bringing the calamity upon the Egyptians. So as we read the biblical text, we realize that for the Egyptians, they were seeing calamity. As we read it, we see that behind it all is the orderly, progressive hand of God, progressively intensifying the judgments upon the Egyptians until finally Israel would be released from that bondage. And so certainly it's a supernatural action. And the text emphasizes that it's a supernatural action that shows the power of Yahweh vis-a-vis the gods of Egypt. And even though scholars have tried to show how every plague was directed specifically against an Egyptian god, probably it is best to take the general statement that is given to us within the Torah itself, in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, repeated in Numbers chapter 33, verse 4, that God was executing his judgments against all the gods of Egypt. That as you take a look cumulatively from plague 1 to plague 10, what it was showing was the impotence of the Egyptian gods. That they were not able, they did not have the power to protect the Egyptians. The Egyptians looked to their gods as the ones who would give, obviously, blessing, fertility to their animals, who would bring the abundance of their crops, the one who would support Pharaoh, and as they worshipped and served their gods would give them protection and give them blessing. And of course, what takes place here is Yahweh shows that he is superior to all the Egyptian gods. And certainly the biblical text does say that this is a polemic against the Egyptian gods, that at the end they are shown really to be impotent, that they stand really judged before the God of the Israelites. And because of the impact that Egypt had upon the ancient world at this point, what took place in Egypt was well known in Canaan and in Mesopotamia and among the Hittites, then certainly this also would declare the greatness of Israel's God to the nations as well. But we also need to see that there are echoes within these first 15 chapters of Exodus that echo back to Genesis 1 to 11. It is very significant, and it's interesting that after the plagues, really the final defeat of Egypt is the events that take place at the sea. And just as the final plague was the killing of the firstborn son within the Egyptian households and even to their animals, and that is justice because the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, sought to put to death the boys and issued a decree in chapter 2 that the children were to be cast into the Nile, were to be cast into the waters of the Nile. And it's very interesting that the final action of Yahweh toward Egypt is the casting of Pharaoh's army into the waters. That it is the Egyptian sons, if we can put it that way, that suffer death in the waters. It is not the Israelites. And in fact, Moses the deliverer is himself protected by a wicker basket covered with tar and pitch in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3. The interesting place, the only other place we have something covered with tar and pitch is back in Genesis chapter 6, the chest, the ark, same term that is used here, that it was a wicker basket, a wicker ark that was covered with tar and pitch. That is a reflection, a remembrance of the ark that was constructed by Noah to write out the judgments that came upon the earth. And so what this is showing is that, okay, God is going to bring destruction upon the land of Egypt that in some way will mirror what took place with Noah. And as we talked about, Noah's the judgment that came upon the earth as a whole was a decreation. The fact that basically the order that God had established in Genesis 1 is upset. And so it's almost like when we take a look at the plagues, we are looking once again at if I might put it this way, a secondary flood. And then after that comes forth Israel. And as we said, the final event, as recorded in Exodus chapter 14, has very definite echoes back to the creation account and to the recreation account that was seen after the flood. It is interesting, beginning in 14:20. So it, that is the angel of God, came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And there was a cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. All right, so this pillar of cloud that had been directing the Israelites moves from the front to the back. And it's now nighttime, and it casts light in the midst of the darkness of the night, a light that will allow the Israelites to go through the sea. In verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. Now, remember those echoes from Genesis chapter 1. Light in the midst of darkness, the waters being divided, the dry land appearing. What does that remind you of? Creation, day 1, day 2, day 3. And so the sons of Israel went through the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and their left. Then the Egyptians took up pursuit, and all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. And it came about at morning that the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion, caused their chariots' wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." We've got the idea now, we're not just fighting the Israelites. We're fighting Yahweh. By the way, remember that when you get to the book of Joshua as well. Same statements will be made by the Canaanites on a number of occasions. We're not just fighting them. It is their God who is fighting against us. And then we see in verse 28, the waters returned, covered the chariots, the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not one of them remained. And that reminds us, obviously, of those who were not protected in Genesis 7, that as the waters came, their life was taken from them. So this is another indication that, okay, God is working to bring about the creation of the nation of Israel, and again showing that he is the creator. He is the one who is able to do what humans cannot do. And in John Curett's book on the Old Testament, or ancient Israel and the Old Testament, he has this charts talking about how not only do we have the echoes, obviously, of a new creation, a recreation, like what took place after the flood for the nations of the earth, now for the nation that God is going to use as a testimony to the nations, but even as the plagues really give a reversal of what has taken place in the first 6 days of creation. So that plague 9, okay, the first day we have light created out of darkness, but in plague 9 we have darkness prevailing over light. We have the ordering and separation of the waters, creative day 2. Plague 1 is chaos and destruction brought by the changing of water into blood. And the fact that this blood-like water can overflow. Day 3, the appearance of dry land. Plague 7 and 8, the destruction of vegetation, hail by the locusts upon that vegetation that came about on the 3rd day. Day 4, the creation of the luminaries. Again, 9, the darkening of the luminaries, plague 9. Day 5, the creation of the birds and the fish and the swarming creatures. Plagues 1 and 2 bring about the death of the fish, and multiplication and death of frogs that come out of the water and then create a stench in the land as they die. And then certainly day 6, we have the creation of the land animals and the humans, and we see the pestilence that attacks the animals in the plagues, plagues 3 through 6, and then ultimately plague 10, where we see the destruction of the firstborn throughout Egypt. And so that the land of Egypt is experiencing the fact that the God who created and the God who wishes to bless his creation, for Pharaoh, because of his resistance to the Lord, he is now not receiving a blessing, he is receiving curse, he is receiving judgment. And he is receiving a judgment in his land that to a certain extent reverses the order that has been brought in creation. Now it's only for a time. Each plague then will, except for the last one, will have continuing consequences, obviously. And they have consequences, but the plagues come to an end. The Egyptian land is not destroyed totally, as was the earth at the time of the flood, but there certainly is a level of judgment. And when we say decreation, that's what we're saying. The plagues are being seen as God's judgments. Just as the flood was God's judgments. But God, and this is a very important concept within the Torah, and then will be seen in the in the former prophets, that as God judges those who are against him, those who disdain the seed of Abraham and therefore disdain God, all right, they receive a curse. But at this point, the seed of Abraham is receiving a blessing, where God is their protector, their guide, as he takes them through the Red Sea, that what God is doing, as it were, is as the Creator God creating now this nation in response to the promise that he had given to Abraham that a great nation was going to come through his physical seed. And this prepares us then what's going to take place with the Canaanites. Same thing. There's going to be judgment upon the Canaanites, those who disdain Israel and Israel's God. They will be cursed. And so they are under a curse. And so God brings his judgment upon them that also establishes Israel within the land, that brings about his blessing upon his people. Now, when again, the latter prophets, God is going to say, now in the same way that when the nations disdained Yahweh in the past, in the present, and in the future, how they come under God's judgment, Israel, when you disdain Yahweh, the same kind of judgment, calamity, will come upon you as well. So certainly we're seeing within the Exodus narrative a reminder of what we've already seen in the early chapters of Genesis, that God is a creator God. He is a God of blessing, but he is also a God of judgment. He's a God who brings curses upon those who resist him. And that's what we see as far as the Pharaoh is concerned as well. Now, probably the overarching interpretive issue of the book of Exodus, in fact, probably the most debated interpretive issue of all of the Old Testament, is number 3, and that is the date of the Exodus. Now, obviously, this is only an issue for those biblical scholars who view the Exodus as a literal historical event. If the Exodus is just a fairy tale, if this is just a theological construct to try to communicate something, but it's really a myth, that it has no substantiation as far as historical fact is concerned, then obviously those biblical scholars who take that position don't lose a whole lot of sleep over when exactly the Exodus took place. But for those both within the liberal school and those within the conservative school of biblical scholarship who hold to a real historical Exodus, this is and has become the greatest area of a contemporary discussion. And no matter which text you look at, Merrill or Kaiser, you will notice that both of them spend quite a few pages discussing this issue of exactly when did the Exodus take place. Now, when it comes to determining the dates, we need to recognize that there are two great problems as far as the extra-biblical material is concerned. First of all, the extra-biblical archaeological evidence that we have is incomplete and in many ways inconclusive. What I mean by that is that as you take a look at the extra-biblical evidence, and you can take a look at the charts on pages 102 and 103 that Walton has given to you, you can realize that what has come about and through the last 150 years through the archaeological revolution has certainly been open to different interpretation. So that those who will take the early date will emphasize certain evidences, and those who take the later date will try to emphasize other evidences. Probably the find at the beginning of the 20th century that really shook up the late date advocates, although now they've just moved the evidence just a little further back, is the Merneptah Stela, Pharaoh Merneptah, who at about 1225 to 1220 BC stated that Israel was a people within the land. That is, within the land of the Canaanites. He put a stela of victory of what he had done within the land. And of course, that means that, okay, Israel is already in the land. Now, this changed the late date because they took the lengthy time of Ramesses the second as being the Pharaoh who then dies, and it was his son when the Exodus took place, but everyone agrees today that's too late. So now Ramesses is viewed basically as the long Pharaoh, and during his reign, by those who take the late date, is when the Exodus occurred. Along with that, you have the fact that there is debate among Egyptologists on the exact chronology of Egypt during this period. So that there is along with the early and late date, there's also early, middle, and late dates that are given for pharaohs in this period from approximately 1500 to 1200 BC. So it's not like Egyptologists have been able to construct, from the material a chronology of the pharaohs that is agreed upon. At times there can be 10, 15 years difference. And you will take a look at different histories, even to this day, not just biblical histories, but secular histories, that will give you different datings as far as the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom era are concerned. Well, that's all the extra biblical data, which, as I said, is open to differing interpretations. Well, what is our basis as evangelicals? Obviously, liberals don't put as much stock into this, but when we come to evangelicals who believe in the authority of Scripture, we have to say, well, what does the Scripture say? Well, the famous passage in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, the author of Kings, as he is speaking about the beginning of Solomon's construction of the temple, says that this occurred in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, and he dates the 4th year of Solomon's reign to being 480 years after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So he says 480 years previously. Now, not to the extent of the Egyptian data, but there are some questions within a number of years and exactly when the 4th year of Solomon's reign was, but it's agreed that it was right around the time period of 966 BC. Now, if the Exodus took place 480 years before this, the date that emerges is the date of approximately 1446 BC. So if we have the beginning of the temple, by the way, not the dedication as stated by Walton, but the beginning of the temple, dedication happens later, 480 years, and it gives us a date of approximately 1446, give or take a year or two either way, as being the year of the Exodus. There is a secondary substantiation for this, in Judges chapter 11. When we get there, we'll find out that this is Jephthah speaking to the Ammonites, speaking about the city of Heshbon. And he brings up, as he speaks about Heshbon, that Heshbon had been conquered 300 years previously. Verse 26, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Ararah and its villages, and all the cities are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years. Why did you not recover them within that time? Right? If you believe that when Israel dispossessed Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, who strove with Israel, and Israel took this territory that had been taken previously by the Canaanites, and as the Israelites defeated the Canaanites, then they got this territory. If you believe that, all right, you had tiled this land before them, and that the Israelites were taking your land, why have you waited 300 years to lodge this attack, this complaint against the Israelites? Well, as you go back into the Torah, you find that this area was taken in the 40th year after the Exodus. So basically, we're dealing with 340 years after the Exodus, and this is probably taking place around 1100 BC, 1100 to 1110 BC. You add the 340 years, and you're right back to the date of what? Right around 1446 BC as the date for the Exodus. So we have two strong passages within the Old Testament that give clear evidence that we are dealing with an early date. But because of, and the Albright school has been very, very strong of taking certain archaeological data and saying, no, the archaeological data better fits into a later date, somewhere around 1290 to 1260 BC. For the Exodus. Well, all right, we can argue the extra biblical material, but what do they do with the biblical material? How do they get around these clear statements? Well, in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, 480 years after the sons of Israel, 480 years is to be understood as equaling 12 generations. And because of the wilderness experience where one generation dies, another generation takes its place, 40 years was used symbolically by the biblical writers as the time period of a generation. Now, we know that really between 20 to 25 years is a better number, somewhere between 20 to 30, around 25 years is a better number, and so 480 years really means around 300 years. And so 300 years added to 1996 BC gets us right around 1266 BC. Voila, there's the answer. Now the problem is, there is a Hebrew word for generation. If the author wanted to say 12 generations, there were words available for him to explicitly say, now 12 generations after the Exodus, but he doesn't. He says 480 years after the Exodus. And in Judges 11:26, they would say, well, this is just a generalization or a rough guess by Jephthah. But Jephthah is writing this to a king, making his points. This is not the time when you're writing a letter to a king over a political issue like this to be guessing at your dates. In other words, if you're going to be trying to make a point, your history should be accurate. And so the context of Judges 11 would lead us away from believing that Jephthah is making a wild guess. That I'm talking about what took place 300 years ago, but really it happened about 150 years ago, or a little less. That's quite a generalization. So on the basis of the biblical record, and this is the way that both Merrill and Kaiser argue, on the basis of the biblical record, the position to be held is the early date. Now you wrestle, and a lot of wrestling has taken place, and not everyone who takes the early date is completely committed to Amenhotep II as being the Pharaoh of the Exodus. As I said, there's debate among evangelical Egyptologists as far as exactly who the Pharaoh was, but certainly within a generation they are placing it at the middle point of the 15th century BC as being the time of the Exodus, because there's no other way you can get around the biblical data. And so with that, and because both Merrill and Kaiser are inherentists, they believe that what the Bible is saying is accurate, and then they seek to try to explain that within what is known today of Egyptian history, and how that then ties in with the archaeological data that has come forth. Now, you're going to get this again in OTI. I just want to really, in a Bible class like this, and as you're getting aware of the history of Israel, just give you the biblical reason why we take the early date. If you want a summarization of the evidence for and against these dates, you can, as I said, take a look at page 102 of Walton. There he gives the 15th century evidence and how that evidence is answered by the late date advocates. And then on the following page, he gives the evidence that is marshaled by those who take the late dates, and the rebuttal to their evidence that is given by those who take the early position. This is basically a summarization of the material that you have within your text. And you might want to have these two charts before you as you read a little bit more of the technical discussion within the text that are before you. But this is an OTI, and we're not dealing here really with archaeology. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say that's the reason that I would hold an early date, is because it's substantiated by the Scripture. And I, like our authors, am a biblical inerrantist, and I believe that when the Bible said that it took place 480 years before the fourth year of Solomon, as it says that it took place 300 years before the warfare of Jephthah, I believe that those numbers are accurate. I believe that they are numbers that are to be taken seriously and not to be argued away as some kind of symbolic or general numbers that really have no historical meaning. Well, of course, they would say they have some historical meaning, but imprecise historical meaning. I would say that they are to be taken and understood precisely, and that leads us to an early date. And you can get into the other ramifications of that in OTI. One final discussion that takes place as far as the book of Exodus is concerned. Oh, before I get that, let me just put this before you, because I said that the chart that we looked at on page 99 of the different chronological systems in Walton, how that these systems are based upon the dating of the Exodus. Now, we talked about the dating of the Exodus. So that is why he refers to, on this side of the chart, notice the early Exodus. The early Exodus with the long sojourn. We take the Masoretic text reading of Exodus 12:40, that there was a 430-year sojourn of Israel within Egypt. And so what we do is, okay, we've got 1446, then we add the 430 years for Israel coming into Egypt in 1876. We see that with the chronology of Jacob and the chronology of Isaac and Abraham. And so we can begin realizing that the birth of Abraham is around 2166 BC. And this should look very, very familiar to you, because this is what you're going to be reading within your text and within the notes of the MacArthur Study Bible. Here's where the chronology based upon the early Exodus and the long sojourn. There are a few scholars who take the Septuagintal reading, take an early date for the Exodus, but then only use a 215-year dating for the sojourn. And so that's why they put the birth of Abraham at about 1952 BC. Then on the other side is the late Exodus, all right, that we've already seen, that the Exodus takes place around in this chart 1270 BC. Now you add the 480 years, etc., and you get the patriarchs again being born around, or Abraham being born around 1950 BC. So that everything is moved forward close to 200 years based upon a late date for the Exodus. And I would have to say today that certainly for those liberals who hold to historicity, this is their approach, and they have swayed many conservatives as well. So that those who would be broadly evangelical today, most of them fit within this late Exodus. There are a few like Cyrus Gordon who take not only a late date here, but the 215 years for the Septuagint, and actually bring the patriarchs another 215 years down, so that we're really taking a look at the birth of Abraham in about 1625 BC. So there are some liberals who take a late Exodus and a short sojourn as being better reflective of the history. And then today we face more reconstructionists, and most reconstructionists today no longer hold to even the historicity of the patriarchs and the Exodus and the conquest. Those who do, as Walton says, would just use these general numbers that are given to you in the last column. So be aware of it, because you're going to see this again in OTI when you get with Dr. Barrick. So be prepared for those numbers and the biblical discussion that underlies it. And like I said, it's an OTI, you'll get into archaeology and more of the extra biblical material. The other great issue that has been discussed, not to the extent of the dating of the Exodus, but certainly the date deals with when the Exodus took place. The route of the Exodus deals with where the Exodus took place. Right? Where exactly did Israel begin, and to where did Israel go as they left Egypt? And this comes from the Moody Bible Atlas, and he takes you all the way into Canaan. So let me zoom in to this area right here as far as Egypt, and that'll get us far enough at this point. There have been, as you can see, three major routes that have been proposed by biblical scholars over the centuries. It is fairly well agreed that this is the area where Israel was located. It was on the eastern portion of the Nile Delta. So that this is the area of Goshen. This is where the Israelites would begin their trek through the Red Sea, or literally as it is in the Hebrew, the Reed Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, the Reedy Sea. The term that is used there is not red. There is a particular term for red. It's not used. And that has given the idea that, and the majority of biblical scholars have moved to a position that it was probably one of the great lakes that are today joined together within the Suez Canal. But then there's three possibilities, Lake Bala, Lake Timsah, and the Bitter Lake, the Great Bitter Lake, as potentials, and these are big lakes. For those of you coming to California, sometime go to Lake Tahoe, one of the biggest, second biggest lake within the world. And you'll realize as you overlook Lake Tahoe that when you're dealing with inland lakes, they can't have enough water and enough depth to put to death an army. And so this is what has been believed. Those who actually go all the way to a fourth lake that they believe was established on the Mediterranean, that this is the northern route, and that actually the water was waters that were basically an inlet that had been brought about by sandbars trapping waters from the Mediterranean, and that this is the way the Egyptians came. However, the Bible makes it very, very clear that they didn't go by the way of the Philistines. They didn't go to the north because of the fact that there were Egyptian installations on the way of the Philistines. There is a second position, a minority position, that is a middle ground that would come through Lake Timsah, and they would see Sinai in this area, Mount Sinai in this northern part of the Sinai Peninsula, and then Israel will continue on to Kadesh Barnea, and then down and around. So a middle. The traditional way is to see them coming through the great Bitter Lake, and the way that basically Beitzel brings them down, and that Sinai is at its traditional place on the southern tip of the Sinaitic Peninsula. And along with that, if Goshen's a little further south, it brings out an alternate route that again would put them into Sinai in this basic area, almost an alternate middle route. And then there has been a further route that they actually traveled down the sea and then went across, and that Sinai, I got to widen it up for you here, that they actually came down and crossed somewhere here at the Red Sea before it divides into the Gulf of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez, and came across and came into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and that's where Sinai is. And again, I think when you get to OTI, Dr. Barrick will give you some article references. This is a newer position, and some of the debate that is taking place on that route. At this point, based upon what we have in the biblical text and what we know from Egyptian records, I would still, like Beitzel, follow a basic southern route as far as the exodus out of Egypt was concerned. But as the geographers will bring up for us, that our knowledge of Eastern Egypt and Sinaitic material from Egypt at this point is open to interpretation. In other words, we're taking a contemporary map. We today use satellite imagery to be able to well establish the basic geography of the land as we have it today. And then we try to fit in the biblical and Egyptian records from the middle of the 15th century BC, because we are early datists, and seek as best as possible to figure out where these locations were. It is not, at this point, a mathematical, scientific response that we are able to say, and this is exactly where all of this took place. And even modern imagery, that it can give us some of the underlying geographical features. But we need to recognize that God was doing something supernatural in the Exodus and for 40 years in the wilderness, and bringing Egypt in and bringing Israel into Canaan. Got to remember that this wilderness did support over 2 million Israelites for 40 years. And everyone agrees, past, present, and future, that is impossible. And we all agree, too, that at this point, through all of our excavations on the ground and all of our satellite imagery that is to help us to know where settlements have taken place in the past, etc., we do not ever have continuing evidence for 2,000 or 2 million people living approximately 3,500 years ago in this general area. We can't look and, 2 million people should have made some kind of impression upon the earth. And yet it is not, it's not there today. Well, the Torah really recounts for us that this is, from beginning to end, a supernatural action. It can't be explained by natural phenomena. And so we are thrust back upon the biblical text. And the biblical text would lead us to say, this is where Israel was. Through one of these bodies of water they came to a place called Sinai, either here, or here, as the proposals are. God gave them the law, and then God had them move on the east side of the Jordan and ultimately conquer the land. And why do we hold that? We hold that because that is what the Bible teaches. Right, one question, and then we'll take a break.
What view does the conservative rabbinic tradition hold? That's the Jews.
They hold to what would be called the southern route. But they were going on incomplete data too. And that's what I'm trying to say, that what we've got to realize is the only complete data we have, the only authoritative record we have is here. That through modern archaeology, modern geographical studies, even the material that has come to us from Egypt, that it is certainly not complete and certainly open to differing interpretations. And of course, because it is, that's what allows individuals who don't want to take the full authority of Scripture as far as particularly dating is concerned, and also the general flow of where the Exodus events took place. It's what gives them the opening they need to reinterpret the Bible according to their criteria, what they have established on other means other than what the Bible taken at face value is communicating. So the only authority, the only historical authority we have from this time period is the Torah. And giving ourselves to the study of the Torah is what will help us to appreciate not only the what, but the when and the where. And certainly the general parameters of the what and the where are given to us within the biblical material. And that's where we have to anchor our faith. that's where we have to begin. And as I said, that's where the textbooks that I've given to you begin. This is the biblical data now, how best to approach it. Now, as far as preaching Exodus, I just want to say two words here. If you're going to preach Exodus, preach all of Exodus. Don't be one of those who gets to chapter 20 and finishes their exposition of Exodus. You're only halfway through what the traditional book of Exodus is. But preaching Exodus, you're going to have to really hone in on two things. Number one, remember our discussion in Genesis, because really the first 18 chapters you're going to be preaching biblical narrative. So the same information we gave you in Genesis obviously pertains there. You get to chapter 19 to 40, and certainly you are now hitting another point, which is preaching biblical law in the sense of biblical commandments. Now, certainly, as we've seen in Exodus 32 to 34, you've got another narrative section, but by and large, chapter 20 on is going to be legal material. And certainly, as we get into Leviticus, we see the same. And I'm going to, again, defer speaking about law and interpretation and preaching it until we conclude the Torah in Deuteronomy. So you gotta hone in on two things in Exodus: preaching biblical narrative, basically the first 18 chapters, chapters 32 to 34, and then preaching biblical law. And we'll think through that second part in a few more sessions. But sometime, prayerfully, the Lord will lead you to be able to preach this great portion of the Torah. Hopefully, when you do, as we spoke last time, that there'll be some better resources available for you to help you in that process. Well, that leads us to the heart of the Torah. That within, again, it was already brought up about the rabbinic tradition. As far as the rabbis were concerned, are still concerned, the most important part of the Torah is Leviticus. Now, those of us as Christians don't have that viewpoint. In fact, I believe more Christians have probably died in their reading through the Bible in a year in Leviticus than any other place within the Old Testament. How far did you get? Well, I got through about the beginning of February. Oh, you died in Leviticus, eh? Yes, but I'm going to do it this year. And then about March the 1st, how's it going? Well, I got through Genesis and Exodus, but I died again in Leviticus. So we as Christians, we tend to have a problem when we get to Leviticus. The Jewish tradition is this is the most important part of the Torah. This is where they begin. And basically go back and go forward. Leviticus is the heart of their study. And some of the great works that have come out in the contemporary realm, not evangelical, but in biblical studies, have come from Jewish scholars who have a love for Leviticus that those of us who are Christian scholars at this point don't have. But it is part of the Torah. It is the centerpiece of the Torah. And as we've already taken a look at our chart, what happened at Sinai from Exodus 19 to Numbers chapter 10 is the very center of the narrative of the Torah. And of course, what we call Leviticus is right in the center of that. All right, that was a good question at the end on how consequential is the dating of the Exodus really to the Old Testaments. Well, you got to realize you have, because once you get to the monarchy, once you get to Saul, David, and Solomon, now we're only debating chronology within a few years. In other words, everyone both liberal and conservative, basically sees from Saul on pretty much occurring within the same decades. We're not talking about generations removed at this point. So that the date that you take on the Exodus, we've already seen going back is going to impact the dating that you're going to have for Genesis, from Genesis 12 on with the patriarchs, and all the events that take place there. And it's also then going to have a great impact, particularly when we get to Judges. We're going to deal with the interpretive issue of the chronology of the Judges when we get there, which is tremendously impacted by the date of the Exodus. So really, the date of the Exodus is the linchpin of the narrative, the historical background of the Old Testament narrative from Genesis 12 to Judges chapter 21. That whole section of Scripture impinges, as far as its background material is concerned, when did these things take place? As we read ancient Near Eastern records, what records were closed at the time of the patriarchs, etc., is based upon what date you hold for the Exodus. And I will state again that the most widely discussed interpretive issue in all of the Old Testaments today, for the last 100 years, about 150 years, has been the dating of the Exodus. And again, I will point you to our textbooks when you realize how many pages are devoted to the totality of Israel's history within those pages, and how much time both Merrill and Kaiser take with this issue of the dating of the Exodus, because so much before it and so much after it is determined by the date one takes for the Exodus. So it really is the major historical interpretive problem, discussion that continues in Old Testament studies. And so you're going to, you need to be aware of it, and certainly as you deal with commentaries from Genesis through Judges, you're very quickly going to have to look at what position do they take on that, because it is going to impact the way they're going to use extra biblical materials within their discussion of the individual biblical passages within their commentary. All right, moving into the portion of Torah that we call Leviticus. By the way, the first thing we need to realize is that the book in the Septuagintal tradition is somewhat misnamed. I can live with Genesis, I can live with Exodus. I really can't live with Leviticus, because it has led too many people astray. Now the Hebrew is simple, and he, that is, Yahweh, called, because that is how this part of the Torah begins. But the translators of the Septuagint called it Levitical, and from that we get our term Leviticus. That is a book pertaining to Levites. Very little of the book of Leviticus pertains specifically to even the tribe of Levi. Leviticus 1:1, speak to the sons of Israel. 4:1, speak to the sons of Israel. It is only when you get to 6:8, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying. All right, you've gone through 5.5 chapters, and now you get some things pertaining to Aaron and his family. But even later, chapter 7, verse 22, 23, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the sons of Israel. Now, in chapter 8 and chapter 9, chapter 10, again, will pertain to what happened with the priesthood. Chapter 11, verse 1 and 2, Lord spoke again now to Moses and to Aaron, saying, speak to the sons of Israel. And you can continue on, and you will realize the bulk of Leviticus is spoken to whom? Not the Levites, but the sons of Israel. So this is not a book pertaining to the Levites. This is a book pertaining to the sons of Israel. Beyond that, we need to realize that the whole of the line of the tribe of Levi were not priests. There was only one line, that is the line of Aaron, that are priests. The broad term Levites is used for those, and we'll talk about this when we get to Numbers chapter 3 and 4, where we have the numbering and the responsibilities of the rest of the tribe of Levi and their responsibilities as far as the tabernacle were concerned. And in fact, in Numbers chapter 4, verse 46, all the numbered men of the Levites, whom Moses and Aaron and the leaders of Israel numbered by their families, etc., 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 were these. And the Levites in particular were the helpers of the priests. Every Levite was not a priest. Every member of the tribe of Levi was not a priest. Only those in the family of Aaron. And by the way, in Leviticus, even when it does speak to the tribe of Levi, it's always to Aaron and his sons. Could I put it this way? There's nothing broadly to the Levites in Leviticus. So the question is, what would I call it? I would call it, well, Israel and the priests. What God said to the sons of Israel and to the priests who ministered on their behalf in the tabernacle. So please don't, and too late now because your paper's already in, but don't say as your first observation, this is a book that deals with the Levites. It does not. It deals with the sons of Israel. And it deals just with one family of Levi, and that is Aaron and the priestly family. So there's a place I believe that our traditional title is somewhat of a misnomer. Now, it is very interesting how narrative time really slows down when you get into Leviticus. In fact, there is a narrative framework even in Leviticus, but usually it's very, very short. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. And very frankly, if there is any portion of the Torah, any book of the Old Testament that is really the Word of God, if you want to use that term very, very literally, where God spoke and this is what he said, it is Leviticus. And as you go through, you realize so much of it is a recording of what God said through Moses, and then Moses and Aaron when you get to chapter 11, and then back to Moses, to all of the sons of Israel. And basically that narrative framework is, this is God speaking. This is what God said to be passed on to the Israelites. Now it is very, very definitely true that as you read chapter 9 and 10, certainly you have narrative there. The narrative of the ordination, the sanctification, the setting apart of Aaron and his sons into the priestly ministry. You have then in chapter 10 the sin of Nadab and Abihu, so that in those two chapters you have more than just a recounting of this is what God said, but you're having some events that actually took place. And then a little later on, as you get to to chapter 24. You have the incident of the son of the Israelite woman and the Egyptian father, who there was a struggling, and the Israelite, the son of the Israelite woman, blasphemed the name and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses to find out what they should do with him. And then the Lord speaks and says this is what to take place for one who blasphemes the name in this way. So you do have some narrative here and there in Leviticus. But certainly the vast majority of it is a recounting of what God said. And so because you have so little, this is what took place, that narrative time really does slow down. In Exodus chapter 40, in verse 2 and again in 17, we find that on the first day of the first month of the second year, the tabernacle was erected. It was raised up so that it might begin to function. When you get to Numbers 1:1, we find now that we are in the first day of the second month of the second year after Israel had come out of the land of Egypt. So between Exodus 40 and Numbers 1, you basically got 30 days. And then as we get into the chronology of the early chapters of Numbers, we find out there's some backtracking even in Numbers to fill in some of the events that took place during the first month. But it is to be assumed as we go through Leviticus within the narrative flow, not that everything is in strict chronological sequence. As I said, we'll see that in the early chapters of Numbers. But the fact that certainly in the Leviticus, we have to have the tabernacle functioning before the narrative framework of Leviticus makes sense. And everything that took place in Leviticus took place at Sinai. And by the 20th day of the second month of the second year, Numbers 10 will tell us they're going to leave Sinai. So strictly between Exodus and Numbers, it's 30 days. The most we can lengthen that out is 50 days for the events and the speaking that God gave to Israel in Leviticus. So you can see how things have really slowed down. Yeah, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, creation to Abraham, very quickly. Then slowing down on 4 generations of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his sons. Although Jacob will live a long time into the lifetime of his sons. And then how we've slowed down to take a look at the events of the Exodus, after speeding through that gap, the events of the Exodus. And now, as we come to Sinai, and even with the totality of 11 and a half months that Israel stays at Sinai, now how much is concentrated on these last 5 weeks or so that Israel is at Sinai and the word of God that is given to them there. Why this concentration? Because now the tabernacle is functioning. The tabernacle plays a very, very important role in Israel's relationship with Yahweh. And so it needs to slow down so that they understand how the tabernacle functions. And now with God's presence among them in the cloud, above the mercy seat, in the most holy place of the tabernacle, what that meant as far as what Israel as a people, as God's people, as Yahweh's people, should be as they leave the tabernacle and live in their society and will be taken into the land of Canaan to live among the nations that will surround them. And it was not God's plan for the nations to be actually among them. But because of their disobedience in the conquest, that happens. But nevertheless, it was still God's plan that here's Israel, and here are all the nations around them looking and seeing what is taking place in Israel and among the Israelites. And so this is Leviticus, and this is why it slows down. This is your God. This is how you maintain your relationship with your God. And this is what God expects of you as his holy people. That is Leviticus. And that is the heart, as we said, of the Torah. Now, major themes. Now, like you, and when I first started teaching this course, the first theme that I always talked about was holiness. Then I read the article on the theology of Leviticus by Richard Havervack that is in the new NIDOT, the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. And after I read his article, I said, Dr. Havervack is right. The overarching theme of this part of the Torah is the presence of Yahweh. And even as you read the Torah, you pick up something of the uniqueness now of Israel's experience with Yahweh, this God who had spoken to the patriarchs, this God who had spoken to Moses and acted through the plagues and the Exodus event and the beginning of the provision for Israel within the wilderness that they had since leaving Egypt. But to realize, of course, that is a God who is still somewhat removed. And yet, as what we call Exodus comes to an end, to, as we talked about on Wednesday, that the very presence of Yahweh was once again among humans. Something that had not been true in this sense since the events of the Garden of Eden, when God came and fellowshiped and interacted intimately with Adam within the garden. And so at the end of Exodus chapter 40, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, verse 34, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And so this cloud is now representative of the glory, the presence of Yahweh filling the tabernacle. And then he goes on to say throughout their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day it was taken up. Now Yahweh is going to personally, from among their midst, direct their steps as they go toward the promised land. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night in the sight of all of the house of Israel. So this was something that, even though it was above the mercy seat and only the high priest on the Day of Atonement could actually go behind the veil before the mercy seat, yet nevertheless, the picture that Moses gives, and of course he's speaking to those on the plains of Moab who have 40 years of experience of this, those that were 20 years of age and underneath when this is all beginning, and those that are growing up that have been born in the wilderness and know nothing different, is the fact that, all right, no matter where you are in the camp of Israel, day or night, you can look toward the tabernacle, you can look toward the holy place and see what? By day the cloud, and by night the cloud turns into fire. And this was their reminder that Yahweh was present among them. Glory has the idea of of someone's outward expression of their weightiness, of their importance, of their prominence. And so when it says, all right, this is the cloud and the glory of the Lord has an idea of some outward expression that reflects the prominence and importance of Israel's God. And of course, this cloud that would lead them, this fire by night that could be seen, was a visible representation to them of the splendor and the greatness and the prominence of their God. And so the presence of the Lord, and as you come to Leviticus, and there's so many passages, I can only give you the chapters, but throughout Leviticus, it speaks about as they bring their offerings to the tabernacle, they are bringing their offerings before the Lord, before Yahweh. They are coming, as it were, before Yahweh's presence to present their offering. And of course, as the sons of Israel came to the tabernacle, and as the priests would minister in the tabernacle, they could never come before Yahweh without what? Without the offering, without the sacrifice. That it was certainly recognized by them that these offerings that God gives are the means by which we can come before the Lord. This is the way we can come into the presence of the God whose glory we can see. And so this term is used again and again, and realize that with the context we're looking at, we can see it in 1:2, as Moses begins to speak to the sons of Israel, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, that is an offering, it is a burnt offering, that he may be accepted, at the end of verse 3, before the Lord. Right? This is the means of acceptance. This is the way you can come into the presence of Yahweh, is by means of offering. And as you go through Leviticus, and we'll talk about the sacrificial system, that obviously for all the sons of Israel, here are offerings, and then ultimately in chapter 16, here is an offering that is brought by the priest on behalf of all Israel on the great day of atonement. And this is why God had established the tabernacle, so that in this means Israel, through the offerings, could come before the Lord, could come and be acceptable before the Lord and enjoy fellowship with Him. But beyond that, and particularly when you get to chapter 18 and following, Moses gives the word of God of many activities. And the activities that Yahweh speaks is about the fact that I am Yahweh, your God. So chapter 18, verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, I am Yahweh, your God. And just in case you forget, take a look at the tabernacle. See the cloud. Remember that Yahweh is your God, and Yahweh is in your presence. Therefore, you shall not do certain things of the Egyptians and the Canaanites, the Egyptians from the past, the Canaanites, that you're soon going to encounter. Chapter 19, verse 2, you shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy. You shall reverence father and mother. Keep my Sabbaths. I am Yahweh, your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves molten gods. I am Yahweh, your God. Verse 12, you shall not profane my name. I am Yahweh. And you go through these chapters, and at significant points, the Lord keeps reminding Israel what? I'm Yahweh. You live life before me. I am the one in the midst of you. My presence is seen. And as your God, I am directing you in what my requirements for you are. And so I am Yahweh, your God. And that's all you need to know. It's Yahweh speaking. You can come over again to chapter 26. Verses 1 and 2. Don't make for yourself idols. I am Yahweh your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths, reverence my sanctuary. I am Yahweh the Lord. Verse 13. I'm the Lord God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Verse 44. I will abhor them and destroy them who break my covenant. I am Yahweh. And verse 45. I will remember for them the covenant with the ancestors, that I might be their God. I am Yahweh. And so throughout Leviticus, we have this echoing of the fact that Israel is to take seriously the fact that they are Yahweh's people, and Yahweh now has his presence among them. Now, we've already picked it up, that the great characteristic of Yahweh is his holiness. And because he is a holy God, he requires holiness in his people. And in fact, this was the priest's responsibility. The priest's responsibility was to teach the sons of Israel, verse 10, to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. And so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord had spoken to them through Moses. And that is the reason, of course, why Nadab and Abihu have the fate that they have, is because they have not kept this distinction. That they have profaned the tabernacle. They have brought incense with strange fire, and that's an interpretive issue that we'll look at on Wednesday. But the important thing is to realize, look, the priests have a great responsibility to teach Israel and to show by their actions that which is holy and that which is common, that which is clean, and that which is unclean. Now we'll have to end at this point because with this little chart, because this is so much of the vocabulary of Leviticus. 10:10, make a distinction between holy and profane, clean and unclean. And many times we read that and equate holy with clean and profane with unclean. And the language, as you trace it through, of Leviticus does really not allow that to be seen. That you have holy and profane, or common, the common which can be clean or unclean. Now what you have is, you have the common. The common can be sanctified or consecrated. When the common is set apart, consecrated, it becomes what? Holy. Holy is that which is set apart. That which is now uncommon. Now, to take that which is holy and consider it or use it as that which is common, to profane it, is a sin. So profaning the holy is sinful. But then that which is common. That which is common, that is to be sanctified or to come in contact with that which is sanctified, has to be clean. If the common is polluted, it becomes unclean. And to pollute and have that which is unclean, in other words, to pollute that which is common, is again to miss the mark, to be sinful. The unclean has to be cleansed or purified to be made clean, to be able to come into contact with the holy. So particularly when you take a look at chapters 13, 14, 15, when something is considered unclean, what is necessary before that individual can come back into the camp or come into the among the people of God, coming to the tabernacle to enjoy fellowship before Yahweh? Well, they can't do it until they're purified of their uncleanness, have made clean so that they can come into contact with the holy. And then once something is sanctified and set apart for God, once that is holy, then that is not to be profaned. We'll talk about the different aspects of holiness in Leviticus as we begin on Wednesday, but just as an instance of this is the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a holy day. So that means because it is a holy day, it's set apart unto Yahweh, it is consecrated, it is a different day than the common 6 days of the week. Then what you do during these 6 days, you don't do on the Sabbath because it's holy. To work on the Sabbath like you did the other 6 days is to profane the Sabbath. Now, one of the things that we'll see is that when you think in terms of that which is common, this category of unclean is going to be such that Israel is going to realize that almost without trying at times, they find themselves in uncleanness before Yahweh. And the fact that they need to be purified. Just living life as fallen people in a fallen world brings a measure of uncleanness. That purification needs to take place. And so purification is very, very important, but purification is different than consecration. So that one is cleansed and then one is set apart by God for his purposes. Now, Israel as a people were what? They were holy. They were a set apart people to God. But when they found themselves in an unclean state, they needed to be cleansed so that once again they could be truly used by Yahweh as his holy people. All right, we will trace this out a little further on Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit more about what is seen as holy within the book of Leviticus. We will think through a little bit further this concept of holiness and that which is profane, common, and that which is clean and unclean as we take a look at the book and see how these concepts are very, very vital as far as the Israelite was concerned in maintaining their relationship with Yahweh.